A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the day 2 of the ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2026, focusing on Gen Z-led regime changes across South Asia. We're starting today's proceedings with panel 4, titled Anti-Corruption Movements and the Politics of Structural Change in South Asia. This session will explore why anti-corruption discourses resonate so deeply with the public and whether these movements offer genuine alternatives or simply reinforce existing power structures. To lead this discussion today, we're delighted to have our chairperson, Dr. Rajni Gamage. She's a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS. Dr. Gamage will be joined by our distinguished speakers, Professor Arjuna Parakrama, Professor Nadeem Malik, and Mr. Kunda Dikshit. A reminder to our audience that this session is being conducted via Zoom, so we encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A chat for the interactive segment. I shall now invite Dr. Rajni to commence this session.
Right. Thank you, Kanika. And good morning, everyone. I think it's still quite early in the day for us joining from various South Asian countries, but I also know that there are people joining from elsewhere, including later in the night in the US. So everyone, welcome to day 2 of the ISAS annual conference. Yesterday, we had 3 panels and quite rich discussions. The theme of the conference is on what is termed as the Gen Z protests. There was an unpacking of what it meant to ascribe these protests with the title Gen Z, and the regime changes that happened, especially in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh. And the discussions were centered around these on topics of ideology, the relevance of ideological politics, the politics of visibility of protests, and these were some of the themes that were discussed yesterday. So today, this morning's panel is on anti-corruption movements and the politics of structural change in South Asia. We saw within many of the protests that I just mentioned, there was this sentiment or this demand for a system change. And hopefully today's discussion can also probe this question in terms of what kind of consensus there is on the system change, and also why anti-corruption appears as a very powerful discourse and mobilizing tool, especially within these protests. So I'll just pose a few questions that will be deliberated on in this panel, and I'll then introduce the speakers. So the panel explores the politics of anti-corruption movements across South Asia, investigating why such discourses resonate deeply with the public. So the question really is why is anti-corruption quite successful as a mobilizing force? What are the rhetorical tools that are used within it to give it a convincing narrative of why things turned out quite so badly within these countries? And also, what are the limits of this discourse? So this is something that we hopefully can explore in terms of how much of conversion there is in terms of this anti-corruption mandate, and how much of public legitimacy does it confer. The second question is really what might anti-corruption narratives, the frontlining of them, the dominance of them, do they sideline other more powerful structural critiques of the current situation, whether it is on development, whether it is on the role of ideological politics within our countries. And then finally, in countries which promised a system change, a structural change, do these pro-anti-corruption movements, do they offer genuinely radical alternatives, or do they ultimately reinforce existing power structures? Are we expecting too much of an anti-corruption mandate? Can it not maybe address all of these structural ills that we're talking about, but does it have at least a functional role? And these are some of the questions that we wanted to pose to the panelists. And without taking the time more, I will introduce our first speaker, Professor Arjuna Parakrama, who is a Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Peradeniya, Sri Lanka, and quite a well-known intellectual figure in Sri Lanka. And I invite Professor Arjuna to now make your comments.
Thank you very much, Rajni, and thank you for the institutions involved for inviting me. You may find that I'm being a bit contrary, but what to do? I mean, I will go through my abstract in detail. There are about 10 points I raise, and I would like to take about 2 or 3 touchstones and use them as examples, concrete examples, because 15 minutes is very little. So let me begin by first saying the sort of polemical, like the thesis on Feuerbach, I mean, to sort of make certain statements. One, that since the end of the civil war, Sri Lanka has graduated from rampant corruption to unfettered kleptocracy. So we have a situation where beyond corruption, we are kleptocratic. And I think there's an interesting study by TISL where they identify 17 elements of what constitutes a kleptocracy. Let me first explain. So there's a weakening of the country's accountability system, influence on and interference with public officials, that still remains, abuse of state-owned enterprises. I mean, in fact, state-owned enterprises should be called abused state-owned enterprises. There aren't any that aren't abused. Then entertaining unsolicited proposals, manipulation of public procurement procedure, rule by family. Now we have a replacement of rule by family to rule by party, and I will try to explain that. Manipulation of state and private media continues, weaponization of social media, suppression of civil society, involvement with professional gatekeepers in enabling kleptocracy, and the use of illicit financial transactions. So the relative medium risk, those are the high risk, the medium risk, appointment of military allies to key government positions. This continues, alas. Manipulation of states' foreign policy, influence on the judiciary. I shan't say anything about that. Manipulation of the electoral process. We have an election that's due, which has not happened. And, we're not clear. It's now 7 years since the devolution setup has not been implemented. We don't see any progress on that. Engaging with criminal networks, neglecting the anti-corruption legal framework, and so on. And there are, of course, questions of media repression, collusion with the private sector. So, I mean, it's clear, I think, that we do have something like a kleptocratic state, something that's gone beyond the question of corruption. So now let's move to the leadership shuffle. So we had, as a result of the Aragala, what they call the people's struggle, there was not a change in regime, there was actually a change in leadership. The old leadership, which was completely corrupt, handed over to another person, while the entire parliament and so on remained. And so there was a kind of a shift which was more cosmetic than something else, because it was a manipulated protest. So I'm one of the few people, I think, who will publicly say that the Aragali or the protest was manipulated, that it had certain very important elements of a popular uprising, but that right from the beginning there were various elements that were there. If you go into it, you will discover, this is not very nice because we like to think of saviors, we like to think of situations where there's always a wonderful movement coming along, but it reflected many of the things. There were, for example, different arenas within the struggle, which is located in that central Golface area near the presidential secretariat and the prime minister's official residence. There were little areas, one controlled by one party, another controlled by another party, a third controlled by a dissident group, a fourth which was a more liberal kind of civil society group. So these ramifications were there, and in fact evidence is coming out that much of the resources came from middle and upper class sources, which were then interested in manipulating this, and it became manipulated. So what we had, at least towards the end of it, maybe the third month or so of the protest, the protest itself was developing. I mean, we learn, as it were, but broadening. For example, there was a key moment where the protest, which was singular majoritarian, capital oriented from the western province, we actually were able to have a memorial for those who have fallen in the war period. I remember we participating. There was some protest. There was a monk who came. There was a retired soldier who came and said something. But nonetheless, they allowed a candlelight memorial. So the movement was progressing when very rudely and very sharply and very strategically it was diverted to a violence that could not be controlled. So on the 9th of May, there was an attack by the then government individuals in an organized way, which then unleashed an attack across the country where about 80 parliamentarians were attacked. One parliamentarian was killed. So it was channeled in a different kind of way. But it was very unfortunate because I think it was moving. With another 6 months, maybe we'd have been able to become a more open democratic thing as opposed to the factions. And I must say this, and this is very controversial, that the current ruling party was not fully on board with the struggle because they could not own it. It was owned by various other people. It was quite amorphous, so they were not there. So now what you have, of course, was the middle class was behind this. They financed it, they provided various kinds of things, but they backed out when their needs were met. Their needs were, of course, the question of, were there queues? Now we're having queues again, so it's interesting. But were there queues? Were there, shortages of gas, shortages of fuel, food shortages? So those are the kinds of things that led to this. It was not a full understanding of the socioeconomic nature of the crisis that Sri Lanka was in. Okay, so we move from there to the regime has changed now, but the dominant ideologies remain. This is, I think, our issue that we need to look at. I don't think the popular movement changed ideologically. This system change can become it's a cliche. It means nothing and everything, and as a result, there are lots of problems with that. When something is so overarching, you can't put a finger on it, and then it means different things to different people. I want to just give you one example about the question of the ideology. We've had this government which came on a platform, it won unprecedented majorities in the north with the minority, so-called minority Tamils, and in the plantation areas with various promises. But they have now appointed about 5 or 6 committees, and unfortunately, all of the committees are predominantly Sinhala and Sinhala Buddhist and Sinhala Buddhist men. So what we have, for example, is a clear reinforcement again and again and again of this Sinhala majoritarian thing. We have a constitutional council which is very badly prepared, 10 members, 7 from parliament, 3 from civil society. This was initiated in 2000 rather. Now in 25 years, for the first time, this government, the prime minister and the leader of the opposition, they appointed 3 civil society members, all of whom are Sinhala, for the first time. So we have the kind of anomaly where we have an archaeological advisory committee of 23 people. It used to be 19 or 20. All of the 19 or 20 were Sinhala Buddhist. I think in Singapore, you may not understand the nature of ethnicity and the contradictions and the problems of the minimum representation required, not sufficient, but necessary. So you have a archaeological advisory committee which advises on contested archaeological sites. Some say they're Hindu, some say they're Buddhist, some say something else, and you appoint all Sinhala Buddhists. You can imagine what it does. So that's this government which claimed to be outside the Sinhala nationalist thing. So those ideologies remain very clearly. Then we move to the question of the active to passive. That, I think, is a key advantage and the key benefit from the Aragalaya, that we used to elect people once in 4 years or 6 years or 5 years and then go to sleep and then expect them to do everything and then come back again and elect somebody else. Now we've moved to being active. I must say this though, and give me a minute for this. While it is perhaps right to say young people were involved in this Gen Z, Gen Z stuff I don't like. But of course, part of the reason, let me explain why the Aragalaya did not work, is this generational labels, stereotype, and profile, often reducing people to trivial or implicitly biased traits. In this sense, they are not far removed from horoscopes. And those of us from Sri Lanka, South Asia know what horoscopes are. Broad interpretive frameworks, in this instance, based on years of birth, mistaken for meaningful explanation. Using the Gen Z as a serious analytical tool is often a form of lazy sociology. It substitutes the depth of intersectional analysis with the convenience of a catch-all label. In doing so, it can obscure how class, geopolitics, gender, and ideology structure social divisions. As a result, such labels often reinforce existing power structure and social divisions. These labels function both as a marketing tool and a social fiction, flattening important differences while embedding a Western bias that overlooks global diversity. They also conflate distinct analytical categories such as age or period effects, promoting misleading or oversimplified conclusions. So in some sense, the label is wrong. In some sense, the label being somewhat appropriate for the Aragalaya says the Aragalaya stuff is wrong. That what they produce are these kinds of oversimplified things. Gen Z may be doing things because they are young, and we did them when we were young, and the next generation will do it to their. So that's what we mean by age effects, right? And period effects. So anyway, to get back to this, I want to do one slide, if I have, just to show you what I mean by this question of quiet corruption versus real corruption. The government is doing what we call retail corruption work. Unfortunately, they identify corruption with corruption by their enemies. So corruption by their enemies is highlighted, not corruption, incipient problems with themselves. And they have an argument which says, we are honest, we are trustworthy, we are not crooks like the others, so give us time. But anyway, if I can share, let me see if I can share. How does one share?
There's this button at the bottom called share. And if you click that.
Have I clicked it right? Oh dear.
And then if you click that, you have to select the document that you want to share. You double click on that document.
Zoom or Team? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. Let me do this.
Right.
Can you see the slide? Okay.
Yes.
Not coming. Yeah. So governance against corruption, it must address both what I call the retail, the visible, and the systematic or the quiet corruption. Now, this is not happening. So there's a lack of consultation, mistakes, and injustice. The least powerful are the worst affected. This is, I think, we're coming out of a number of crises, Ditwa being another example that I will discuss. But that shows the least, those who were victims become victimized again by the reforms. So this is the background. I'm trying to use the Employees Provident Fund, our superannuation funds. These were what were used by the IMF restructuring, domestic debt restructuring. So the balance is the hugest fund that we have, 4.3 trillion, right? They're forced to save. Their income has been is equal to the cigarette tax, but we have not increased the cigarette tax. Now, we can't say X was profited by the cigarette tax. It's below the WHO level. But the point is, some corruption is involved. We don't know what it is. So we see cigarette tax has gone down. It's below the WHO level, but you're taxing the poorest. The poorest who are not within tax range, their superannuation funds are taxed. Now, if you look at the 17 countries that have gone to the IMF, ours is the only one where the domestic debt restructuring has taken place in relation to the savings of these people, the savings of poor people. Now, there was the IMF, we have agreed that there should be consultation, and the central bank should divest itself from its interest in the fund, because there's a conflict of interest. They manage the fund and they have cut the fund. Their own provident fund, their own employees' provident fund is at 29%. They are sealing ours at 9%. Nothing has happened. They've done nothing. None of the key milestones are met. The IMF doesn't care, and the government is also not interested. This is corruption of a different kind. This is corruption because if the fund was divested from the central bank, people would protest. Now the people don't know. 2.6 million people don't know. 22.6 million dormant accounts. They don't know that their fund has been denuded by to the tune of about 40%. So what we're saying, there's no consultation, none of that. So that's just an example to tell you that what is happening is precisely that superficial kind of thing. Oh, we want some change, and the change has been, we are talking about this change in a particular kind of way, but there's nothing concrete. Now, if I go to the really concrete example, Ditwa, as you know, in November, we had this cyclone, and it has disproportionately affected the poor Malaya Tamil community in the plantation area. But what has happened as a result of that is they are not getting compensation. There are 60,000 of them still in refugee camps, and they're in schools mainly. So they have to vacate the school during the daytime for the school and come back. There are no toilets, no facilities, and it's only for them. The language for reform, the language for the forms are all in Sinhala. So they don't have it in their own language. A whole series. The administration is through the Plantation Raj, as somebody pointed out, you're replacing the white plantation Raj with the brown Raj. So language issues, issues of deprioritization, issues of structural racism, all of that feed into this. As Naomi Klein would would describe, there's a shock doctrine. So what they can't get done in a normal time, they use the crisis to get done. That has not changed. To me, we must start moving from anti-corruption, which is the weapon against your enemies, to anti-corruption, which is much more systemic and which looks at this quiet corruption where you can't identify X or Y is benefiting. But the system is such that the majoritarian group benefits, the minorities are discriminated, and the structure persists like that. I think I'll stop now. I'm probably over time. Am I?
You're just on time. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yes.
And sorry it was a bit disorganized.
No, thank you, Professor Parakrama. And for, I think, touching on those class dimensions, the ethnic dimensions within the short period of time that was given to you. Most interestingly, because this panel is also looking at questions of how much of structural change is possible alongside narratives of anti-corruption. Your comments also remind me of a speaker's comments, Professor Dina Siddiqui's from yesterday, who was commenting on Bangladesh's context, where she said this phrase that nationalist refusal is not epistemic disruption. And even within the Aragalaya, we saw these signs, these elements of unity and harmony and the coming together of ethnic communities. But whether that translates at a more systemic structural level, I think Professor Parakrama's comments speak to that. So I will now move on to the next speaker. Professor Parakrama, if you could help to unshare the screen.
How do I do that? Oh dear.
Okay, I think it's okay. All right, so I would like to welcome our next speaker, who is Professor Nadeem Malik, Associate Professor at the Asia Institute, University of Melbourne in Australia. Professor Nadeem, I hope will provide us comments on the situation in Pakistan as well as any broader reflective comments as well. I welcome you to speak now. Professor, you are muted.
Sorry, thanks for the invitation, and I'm glad that I'm here and for the opportunity you provided me to share my, to share my 2 cents, to the topic. Let me share my slides. Okay, corruption in Pakistan is massive, and systemic corruption is massive, and there's a lot written on this. There's a lot of policy literature also available on how to overcome corruption, etc., etc. But the problem is in countries like Pakistan is that the moment a policy, even the best policy, is implemented, it is subverted by the power structures. So there has been relatively less attention paid to marginalize or use corruption discourses against your political opponent. Therefore, my topic today is anti-corruption as political strategy, and I'll sort of discuss a little bit on from military coups to Imran Khan in Pakistan.
Professor Nadeem,
specifically because Imran Khan political election campaign was all based on anti-corruption.
Professor Nadeem, you were breaking up quite a bit, and you are muted now. Sorry, I think you have to unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, I have to share it again.
You're breaking up quite a bit, Professor
Sorry,
Nadeem.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, now we can hear you. But if you break up again, probably we might have to, I guess, turn off your video. But let's try again.
yeah. I mean, you can understand I'm in Pakistan these days.
Yes.
That's because of that. Anyway, so you could hear whatever I said so far.
Not very well, Professor Nadim. I'm just wondering if turning off your video would help to.
Okay, so let me start it again. Let let me start it again. I hope you can hear me now, right?
Yes, yes,
Unstable internet
yes.
connection.
Please
It
go ahead.
was that there's massive corruption in Pakistan, massive systemic corruption, and there's been many. There's a lot written on it. There's a lot policy, research being conducted on it, and suggesting different policies and reform strategies, etc., etc. But the problem in countries like Pakistan is that even the best policy, when it is implemented, it is subverted by power structures. So introducing policy merely means nothing much. But relatively less attention has been paid in the academic discourse, at least, on how anti-corruption discourses in Pakistan have been criticized and been used to legitimize, for example, military coups, and to use against the political opponents. So I'll give you a brief, historical background as well, to make you understand the very discourses of anti-corruption as political strategy being used in Pakistan. Imran Khan, I have I'll particularly focus as well after discussing military coups, because Imran Khan's entire political campaign was based on anti-corruption and the issue of corruption, on which basis he mobilized people for the vote. So today, I examine how anti-corruption politics have worked in Pakistan modern political history. So instead of treating corruption talk as neutral good governance, I treat it as a political technology, a way to claim moral authority, justify breaks with ordinary politics, and reshuffle who controls state resources. So I traced three military takeovers, 1958, 1977, and 1999, showing how each used narratives of corruption to delegitimize civilian leaders and centralize authority. I then placed Imran Khan's electoral anti-corruption campaign in this longer trajectory. He mobilized through elections rather than a coup. Yet, he relied on a similar moral framing in which corruption is presented as a primary cause of national decline. The core argument is that enforcement-heavy accountability drives often consolidate power and reconfigure elites, but rarely transform durable, patron-client structures and rent-seeking, etc. Uh, a historical political economy approach asks, not only is corruption high, but also who benefits from the way corruption is defined, targeted, and punished. In Pakistan's post-colonial setting, scholars have argued that the state apparatus, especially bureaucratic and military institutions, has often been more influential than party politics, shaping recurring cycles of intervention and control. Anti-corruption rhetoric then functions as a powerful mode of legitimization. It can portray politics as morally rotten, elevate corrective authority, a coup maker or outside leader, and justify extraordinary centralization. Yet enforcement first accountability is not the same as structural reform. And for example, NAB, the National Accountability Bureau in Pakistan, which was established by General Musharraf, its own strategy document argued later on that enforcement alone repeatedly produced laws and agencies, but unless the causes of corruption are addressed, corruption continues and institutional legitimacy erodes. But these dynamics help explain why anti-corruption can become a recurring institutional power consolidation. Across regimes, anti-corruption politics tend to follow a recognizable pattern. First, corruption is narrated not just as wrongdoing, but as the explanation for national decline, often paired with the language of chaos, incompetence, and betrayal. Second, this framing supports extraordinary politics. Coups are justified, military coups are justified as rescue missions, while electoral outsiders portray themselves as uniquely able to cleanse the system. Uh, Third, the rhetoric is operationalized through institutions, disqualification laws, tribunals, and anti-corruption agencies that can rapidly reshape political competition. Finally, enforcement frequently becomes selective. The promise of across-the-board accountability collides, with political incentives to protect allies, punish rivals, and engineer new governing coalitions. A central point in the anti-corruption policy literature is that such institutions can be captured and weaponized, becoming part of the political conflict rather than a route to sustain integrity reform. Now, let me just give you a brief historical overview. If the 1958 coup, marks a foundational moment in Pakistan in which corruption became a public justification for suspending constitutional politics. Contemporary and near contemporary accounts emphasize that martial law was legitimized through the moral condemnation of politicians. Corruption was presented as an evidence that parliamentary rule had failed and that the extraordinary intervention was necessary. And this first coup was by General Ayub Khan. The archival material and scholarship show that coup proponents depicted civilian political competition as chaotic and self-serving, aligning anti-corruption rhetoric with the claim that only military bureaucratic authority could restore stability. This moment, matters for a political economy account because it sets a template. First, delegitimize civilian elites through moral language, then centralize authority, then restructure who is permitted to compete politically. The emphasis, is less on changing how patronage works and more on changing who controls it and under what rules. So under Ayub Khan, General Ayub Khan, anti-corruption was operationalized through disqualification regimes. Contemporary, and later institutional summaries describe how the Public Office Disqualification Order, PODO, and the executive body's disqualification order, APTO, uh, you know, expanded the state's capacity to investigate alleged misconduct and to encourage voluntary withdrawal from politics. Importantly, this was not merely an administrative reform, it was a political cleansing mechanism. By sharply narrowing who could participate, the accountability project helped remake the political arena under conditions favorable to the regime's controlled political architecture. The reported scale, thousands disqualified or pushed into retirement, signals an effort to reshape elites, not simply prosecute individual wrongdoing. From a political economy perspective, this matters because such cleansing can relocate patronage authority. It removes some brokers, empowers others, and strengthens central control without eliminating the underlying logic of exchange between state resources and political loyalty. Then, Ziaul Haq, General Ziaul Haq took over again, in 1977, another military coup. That shows how accountability talk can justify suspension of normal democratic timelines. While early promises often included elections, key analysis of the period described a shift in priorities. The military regime turned to an accountability agenda that simultaneously delegitimized the previous civilian leadership and rationalized the delay of elections. This is significant because the postponement was not treated as a pure power grab. It was narrated as a necessary step to ensure malpractices and corruption, corruption were addressed before democracy could return. So human rights reporting also suggests that the accountability timeline became central to the regime's legal positioning. Structurally, the outcome resembles the earlier pattern. The regime's legitimacy claims depend on moral condemnation, while the political field is restructured through detention, screening, and controls that disable opponents and advantage new alignments. Then the coup of Musharraf in 1999 takeover. So Musharraf 99 takeover is particularly important because it institutionalized the accountability project through National Accountability Bureau, an institution is established, and the National Accountability Ordinance legal framework that he introduced. In his early public messaging, accountability was central to the regime's claim to legitimacy. Corruption was framed as a core national problem requiring extraordinary corrective action. So the National Accountability Ordinance texts, signals an enforcement-heavy model focused on detention, prosecution, and speedy disposal, with attention to the recovering state money, misappropriated assets, and defaulted loans. Two design elements show why such framework can become politically powerful. The ordinance is retrospective in scope, right? This is very important.
Professor
Reaching
Nadeem,
back to my, yeah,
yes, I
yeah,
invite you to also conclude your comments in the next 2 minutes or so.
yeah, I'll just need 2, 3 minutes. Um, I planned it for 15 minutes. I think I'll need little more time. So two design elements show why such framework can become critically powerful. The ordinance's respective scope reaching back to 1985 and its detention provision, including extended custody for inquiry and investigation. Together, these features create leverage. People can be pressured, negotiated with, or induced to cooperate, turning anti-corruption into a mechanism of political management and bargaining. So, so the core claim in the anti-corruption as political strategy argument is selective enforcement. International Crisis Group reporting from the early 2000s described the accountability process as comprised by selectivity. Accountability courts could be used to sideline opponents and to pressure politicians into joining pro-government alliances. Uh, I'm just skipping some of the points for time limitations. So the story does not move directly from coups to populism. It also passes through institutional embedding of accountability. By the late 1990s, Pakistan had formal accountability laws under civilian rule as well, and these two were widely criticized as politically directed. Now, I'll skip some points here again because of time limitation. So, Imran Khan, let me say few words on Imran Khan case, which is analytically interesting because it shows continuity without a coup. His political rise was not a military takeover, but a populist mobilization that relied heavily on anti-corruption framing. So his Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf manifesto explicitly casts governance failure as an elite problem and promises to replace the existing corrupt order with a system grounded in justice and equity. Uh, in the widely circulated 2018 victory address, Khan presented institution building and the rule of law as the route to controlling corruption, and he placed accountability at the heart of his governing identity, starting with himself, then ministers, and outward. in political economy terms, the analytical question is not whether corruption is real. It is a genuine governance problem, but how the anti-corruption frameworks politically works politically, how anti-corruption frame works politically. It simplifies complex problems into morally legible diagnosis, identifying enemies, and builds a mandate for decisive action that can delegitimize rivals and consolidate authority. So, but once, in government anti-corruption rhetoric often meets the institutional reality of enforcement. Khan publicly argued that prosecuting corruption would provoke intense resistance, and he asked citizens to stand with him against backlash, language that frames accountability as existential politics. But the institutional environment, including NAB's broad perceived features, NAB, National Accountability Bureau, which human rights organization and courts have criticized us for enabling intimidation and politicized targeting. The key point for this presentation is not to adjudicate every case, but to connect structure to strategy. When accountability institutions have strong retention powers and bargaining mechanism, anti-corruption can become part of political bargaining, pressuring opponents, facilitating defections, or shaping coalition dynamics. Finally, the recent period also illustrates that accountability politics is not one direction. So post 2020, Imran Khan himself has been prosecuted and imprisoned on corruption matters as he contests, reflecting the broader pattern that accountability tools can be deployed against different elites as power configuration shifts. So to conclude, just give me 1 minute. The evidence across 1958, 77, and 1999 and the PTI era supports a consistent conclusion. Anti-corruption is repeatedly used as an instrument of legitimacy and power. Leaders portray corruption as the cause of national decline, then claim extraordinary authority to fix it, whether through coups or populist mandates. Institutions such as disqualification orders and NAB-like enforcement agencies become central because they can quickly restructure political competition. They can also be selectively applied. The political economy explanation for limited transformation is that enforcement first strategies are easier to deploy rather than reforms that reduce discretion and disrupt patronage networks. Those deeper reforms threaten powerful interests and require sustained collective commitment. Notably, NAB's own anti-corruption strategy argues that enforcement alone is insufficient without addressing root causes and build a broad integrity system. Corruption persists and legitimacy declines. So anti-corruption can be reformist in principle, but historically it has mainly served as a recurring strategy of power consolidation. With this, I conclude, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nadeem. I think there was a lot packed into that presentation. The connection was not very clear, but we still managed to get, I think, a good sense of the amount of content that you had packed into that, which I think was very useful. I won't attempt to summarize it, of course, but I'll maybe mention 2 or 3 things that jumped out at me. The first, which is the importance of the long duration of corruption as a narrative. I mean, in Sri Lanka, we've heard it, of course, since the 80s. I'm sure if you look even further back, you can locate it. In 2015, it was part of a key political campaign, and then in our most recent election cycle in 2024. But I think it's important to situate this long duration with which corruption has been used as a political legitimacy narrative, and how that in turn enables a sort of selective accountability, which the previous speaker, Professor Arjuna, was also speaking to. And the second point, which is of how this in turn leads to elite restructuring and reorganizing. And you use this term acceptable elites, which I think is a very useful analytical term to use. And then finally, you were speaking to how in moments of crisis or corruption can even create these conditions of crisis, which then legitimize these extraordinary measures that you were speaking about. So I think all of these resonate with various conditions in South Asia, but probably also outside of South Asia. But for now, I will invite our third and final speaker, Mr. Kunda Dixit, the editor and now publisher of Nepali Times newspaper in Kathmandu, to present his comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajni and NUS for inviting me. It's quite ironical that we three septuagenarians are talking about Gen Z protests. But as the previous speaker said, we were all young and angry once. And we've seen it all before. So it's not the first time that we've had an upheaval like this in Nepal. In fact, Nepal is in a seismic zone, and we're used to earthquakes. But this most recent one was a real political upheaval, a tectonic upheaval. We tend to see it as something new. But, in 1980, we had our first student-led uprising. And that was triggered by, and since we're talking with South Asian panelists, that was triggered by the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in Pakistan. And in 1990, the People's Movement against the absolute monarchy was triggered by things that were happening around the world, the pro-democracy movements in Europe and elsewhere. But these were all led by students who were affiliated to political parties. What was different this time was that these were non-political actors, young non-political actors who were organizing through social media. And it was spontaneous, it was globally inspired, but at its core, it had an anti-corruption agenda, the frustration with the government, with lack of jobs. And it was sort of disenchantment with democracy. People had seen the YouTube videos from the Aragalya in Sri Lanka and the Bangladesh protests. And more recently, in August 2025, they'd seen what had happened in Indonesia with the storming of parliament. So these videos translated very effectively through social media to Nepal, through manga memes on social media. And we have to remember that this was a whole post-COVID shift of the general population towards mobile internet communication. And so this became the vehicle through which the information spread. And there had been sporadic protests before against corruption. There was a hashtag Enough is Enough movement led by students, some of the same students. But it didn't really catch on until September 8 and the events of September 8. And what triggered it was the government's ban on 26 social media platforms. And that really sort of was very explosive. There was outrage about it. There was a rally that tried to march towards parliament. It was obviously infiltrated, and 19 young people were killed. This sparked the outrage for the second day on the 9th of September, in which it spilled into arson and vandalism. And also towards the end of the day on September 9th, it was just basically class rage of people who were burning down anything that represented what they saw as the rich and the established. So when anyone with any axe to grind was out on the streets. So it started out as a anti-kakistocracy, anti-kleptocracy protest, but then it sort of spiraled out of control. But unlike Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, I guess the protests were not really against despotic, authoritarian regimes. It was against a flawed but functioning democracy. And people just basically were so frustrated with the economic conditions that they needed to be out on the streets. And we have to remember that Nepal is also one of the few, at that time, was one of the few open societies in Asia. If you look at the map of Asia for press freedom drawn up by these Reporters Without Borders, you'll see Asia as this vast red ocean. And few countries like Japan, Korea, or Nepal are islands of free press and open society at that time. And so, although the mainstream press, and me being from the mainstream press, we were vilified by some of these young protesters as being part of the system. And the reason for that was that the mainstream press, the journalists, were also part of the pro-democracy movements in the previous the people's movement. So the press was identified, the mainstream press was identified with the corrupt leaders. But we have to say that because of the free press, investigative journalism was actually exposing massive corruption at the highest levels of government. And this information from the mainstream press was being disseminated through social media, which actually raised the level of anger and outrage at the government. So it was actually democracy functioning, that an open society functioning, that led to the outrage. I think that is what is a bit different from other parts of South Asia. And then, of course, after the protests, when things were going out of control, the young people organized again on social media and elected a prime minister through Discord. And she happened to be the former Chief Justice, and she gave herself 6 months to have new elections, and we just had that on March the 5th. And that has led to this whole tectonic shift in Nepali politics, because the outcome, although expected, was much bigger. The majority that the RSP party won was much bigger than anyone had predicted. Even I think RSP people themselves were surprised by the results. Just to go back to social media, I think the same platforms that were used on September 8th for the students to organize their rally were the same platforms that were used on September 9th to organize the arson and looting and the burning of the public buildings and everything else. So you see the double-edged sword and the different uses that social media can be weaponized with. And here the role of memes is extremely important. The fact that these manga memes that came to us from Indonesia were used to mobilize young people. And then in the election campaign itself, memes became very important through TikTok and YouTube and Facebook clips. The RSP party didn't really have to campaign as much as they needed to, because the supporters were campaigning for them spontaneously on social media. They were making their own memes and making their own video clips and putting them up in social media. And I think the fact that 60% turnout was quite high. There was 1 million first-time voters, mostly young. But here the role of the Nepali diaspora becomes very important, because about 15% of Nepal's 30 million people is abroad, working either in the Gulf or in the rest of Asia or in the West. And many of them had to leave Nepal because they couldn't get jobs, or they were frustrated with the conditions back home. So they became a very strong anti-incumbent vote. And although they were not allowed to cast their ballots because we don't have absentee voting, they did influence through social media, through Viber and Facebook and WhatsApp. They did influence voters back home in their families and among their friends. So this became an extremely important part of the election sweep that we saw with the RSP. But unlike Bangladesh, where the students and some of the student candidates and the parties did not fare so well in the election, in Nepal, it was just the other way around, where the RSP, which was inspired and took its fuel from the whole Gen Z movement, was the one that swept the elections. They have almost a 2/3 majority in parliament. They'll be expecting a new government to be sworn in by this weekend. We know that the people voted. We know what they voted against. They were voting against a kleptocracy. But many people didn't know what they were voting for. There was this amorphous new party called the RSP, and there was a bit of a savior complex in the persona of Balendra Shah, the former mayor of Kathmandu, who joined the RSP party basically because he didn't have a political platform. And then we saw that Balen effect, where his persona became larger than life. He's a former rapper who sang songs on behalf of the underdog, and he doesn't speak much. Even in the campaign trail, he gave very short speeches. So he was basically trying to do things totally differently from traditional politicians, act differently, look different, and give the impression that he is not one to speak much, but to get things done. And so there he is now with almost a supermajority in parliament, and we wait to see how this cabinet will be formed. I think the test of this government will be on whether the cabinet members, and he's promised a very compact cabinet of only 15 ministers, whether they are chosen because of loyalty or because of competence. And I must say that the RSP party does have quite a few technocrats, experts in their fields. And the finance ministry, for example, is going to someone who's educated in Harvard, worked for the World Bank, and is now back in Nepal. There are others who have done a lot of really good work in education and health. So we wait to see. I think Nepalis are very optimistic about what is coming, but they're also, I think, cautiously wary because we've seen it all before. And as we heard from the previous speakers, this tends to be, these upheavals tend to sort of repeat themselves in an Animal Farm kind of way. The new parliament is very young. The median age is about 33 years, but they're relatively inexperienced. And some of the candidates that won on behalf of the RSP party are unsavory characters who don't really have a very reputable reputation. But let's see what happens. Who gets to the ministerial portfolios? They will be facing immediate challenges, and one that they will go right into headlong from day one will be an economic and energy crisis caused by the war in West Asia. We're already seeing the effect of it throughout South Asia. Nepal gets all its petroleum from India, and India gets it from the Gulf and elsewhere. So any kind of price rise or shortage in India will affect us directly. Then the second challenge that they will have is to deal with the klepto-bureaucracy. So it was not just the politicians who were corrupt throughout, but the Gen Z movement exposed corruption among political parties and political leaders and our serial prime ministers. But we forgot about the bureaucracy there, and they were the rotten part of the state. So how they deal with the klepto-bureaucracy and how the RSP's legislature, when it passes laws or policies, whether or not they get implemented by the bureaucracy will be a big test. And then the third big challenge is that this election was a federal election for a federal parliament. The provincial governments, the 7 provinces in Nepal, as well as the municipal governments, are all controlled by the legacy parties, the ones that totally lost and were obliterated in the March 5th election. So I think with these 3 challenges in mind, we can be, I guess, cautiously optimistic and maybe slightly pessimistic about what is to come, because there is a sense of deja vu that we've seen it all before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dixit. I mean, you kept your comments right on time and very eloquently put them across. Certain recurrences or coming up of themes that were discussed even yesterday, which you mentioned just now as well, which is that the anti-corruption discourse, as well as the protests that we saw within several of South Asian countries, they were, as you mentioned, targeted at political parties, at politicians, but did not as much go sufficiently deeper to address these issues within the bureaucracy, within the military, and other aspects of the state. And also, thank you for mentioning the ongoing war in West Asia, because I think that we have to situate whatever conversation we are having against the global conflict. And also to pick up on this point that you mentioned of cautious optimism with also a significant amount of pessimism and the cyclical nature of what we are going through. And we talked about that slightly. The previous speakers mentioned that before in terms of the elite restructuring. And again, I'm going back to what one speaker from yesterday mentioned, which is that we see many repetitions, but the way in which these repetitions are happening may not be happening in exactly the same way. So, for example, she was mentioning how in the 1960s or 70s, the political climate was probably one of more hope and of change, whereas right now we are very much in a heavy period. This is not to claim exceptionalism of the current times, but also to understand that change may happen in similar ways, but the way in which it unfolds may be quite distinct, and that's useful to study and analyze as well. And so with this, I think we can open the session for the discussion session. We have about 30 minutes. I invite members of the audience to pose questions in the Q&A function, and we can take them. But first, I would like to pose a question or something for the speakers to reflect on and deliberate on and give their opinion on, which is that all the speakers were talking about anti-corruption as a mobilizing tool, as a rhetorical tool, and what that means for structural change or system change. And I wanted to pose a more broader question, which is to ask what its link with the democratic, what its impact on the democratic future of these countries are. Specifically, how does this fronting of anti-corruption as a key mandate of the protests and the governments that came into power after the protests, how does this affect the role of ideological politics? We know that ideological politics have been going through a big shift within this part of the world, especially in terms of how right-wing and left-wing has been conceptualized before. So how does it impact ideological politics? Are ideological politics relevant in the future? It depends on what we define as ideology. And also, importantly, its impact on institutions. We have heard about the weakening of institutions. What kind of scope is there for these institutions to act as a resilient force against the further weakening of democracy? I would like to pose that question to the three speakers, if anyone wants to go first. Yes, Professor Arjuna.
You're muted.
Okay, sorry. All right. Yeah, I would like to say something a bit controversial. I think that that anti-corruption per se is neither a good nor a bad thing. One need to understand. In fact, I was interested in an IMF conference recently. A really well-known figure said corruption is bad because it's not good for development. You know what I'm trying to say? So those sort of instrumental arguments of corruption are very strange and funny. The anti-corruption argument is an ethical argument. It needs to always be an ethical argument, not an argument of instrumentality and so on. But what we are seeing is the weaponizing of anti-corruption to target the enemy, the opponent. So what we have, I think, very clearly is it becomes a way of silencing people, bringing an element of fear and so on, particularly coupled with social media. I think Kunda talked about that very articulately. We have bots and people who, if there is a comment made about somebody, there are 100 bots of various people who attack the person who's making the comment. For example, if we give you an example, there was somebody who made a comment about this clean Sri Lanka being only Sinhala and Buddhist. And he was attacked by hundreds of people who said, who are you? Why don't you go to India? Why don't you get out here? We know who you are. We are going to, get you and so on. So that's the kind of thing. What we're saying is the anti-corruption gives you a holier than thou thing. So we are doing the right thing. Therefore, nobody can contest us. And the anti-corruption then targets all kinds of minor, tiny, minute things. We have a former president who's guilty of probably every corrupt action under the sun, but he's being indicted for going to his wife's honorary doctoral, whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? So these are trivial, minor things which are formulated. But the bigger point I want to make is corruption is part of the territory of the late capitalist stuff that we have. So we can't uncouple corruption from that kind of worldview, that kind of system. That's always there. So in fact, could I make the good point about this, sort of bureaucratic corruption? I think that is even bigger. That's maybe what I'm talking about when I talk about this quiet corruption. So on the one hand, yes, it's people who make money. That's corruption. Other is power itself. The fact that somebody has to go to you to get something done and get something else done, that gives you a lot of power. You leverage that in various other kinds of ways. So I think we have to look at the entire system. Just to look at corruption would be, I think, in one way, just to look at a symptom of the system. Certain kinds of capitalism, particularly crony capitalism, which is what we have, is corrupt. There is no question about it. We remove one set of people and the other set of people will be just as bad, if not worse. In fact, I've been known to say this and I'll deny it, that, a slight amount of corruption and efficiency is better than complete ineptness and this mad honesty to doing things. So we have the RTI, we have various kinds of things. Now people don't take any decision at all because they're scared that they will be called to account for it. So the change must be an epistemic change. The change must be a very huge kind of change. Otherwise, it will always be manipulated by the elites. Elite capture is what you'll have. One group of elites will then, prosecute another group, and then the others will be silenced by it. So two things I want to say. One is it's systemic and it relates to the kind of mode of production that we have. How are we doing this? If we are just just buying and selling and doing all kinds of things that we do. We don't have an entrepreneurial class in our country, unfortunately. We have a class that wants privileges and no, they don't take any risks at all. They just want benefits from it. So in that case, corruption is definitely there, rent seeking. So rent seeking is the kind of thing, and we call it commissions now, and it's an official kind of thing. So one is a systemic issue. The other is how deep it is. It is deep ingrained in everything. Now, people don't get anything done without calling somebody, somebody to not get in a queue or to get something done. You from consulting a doctor to going a police kind of thing. It's a rambling answer, but I'm trying to say it's so wood rotten. It's so part of the system that just identifying 2 or 3 people who are enemies actually reinforcing that people become a little bit more careful. And a little bit more careful means they don't take the decisions that they would take either earlier. So we have a problem. And why I say the problem, in fact, this is to Kunda too. If you have an overwhelming majority in parliament or in whatever that governs, that's dangerous. We have 159 members in one party. Civil society cannot get one single question raised in parliament. It's decided by the party office. We can't ask them to say a bridge is broken. Can you repair it? That question can't be asked because it's entirely now determined by the party office. It says A and B needs to be done. That's corruption. Clear corruption, because that whole democratic process has been subverted in the name of anti-corruption, so that they're not allowed to do anything and they protect each other. So it's a very complicated thing. What I'm saying, maybe we are looking at the problem from the wrong place. We should look at maybe what is the system that generates these kinds of layers and subterranean kind of fields of corruption, as opposed to looking at particular aspects of corruption, because then you unpack one, another one comes. It's like peeling the skin of an onion. You have another one, But so maybe we should look at what is the right question we need to ask about corruption and its intricate relationship with processes of democracy and systems of power and governance.
Right. Thank you, Professor Arjuna. Yes.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I think I'll sort of follow on of what Arjun has been saying. I mean, and this is, in fact, your question is very important, and I have addressed this question in my next book, actually. I see corruption and discourses of corruption where state institutions, through corrupt transactions, create their own absence. And massive corruption to me, massive systemic corruption in countries like Pakistan, to me means absence of the state within the nation state. So I think bringing back the state uh, is the key aspect of it, and that absence is primarily because the boundary between state and society is very blurred, using the argument of Akhil Gupta, the famous anthropologist. So since that boundary is very blurred, there isn't any sharp distinction between state and society. That boundary has to be created to bring back the state, to deliver and to deliver effective, substantial anti-corruption reforms. And that I think will take a lot of time because these are post-colonial states, and I don't think we need to be in rush, because these are 60, 70 years old states, we're talking about in South Asia, compared to Western democracies, which have many hundred years of history and they have evolved in a very different manner. But this point of mine, which I'm referring to, the absence of state vis-a-vis corruption, leads to another important question of how then we should define what corruption is in different contexts when there is a blurring of boundary between the state and society. I mean, now including national anti-corruption bureaus in Pakistan and the way corruption is defined is primarily based on rational actor theory of Weber and Weberian kind of definition of corruption, which leads to, the, to a kind of conceptualization according to which corruption is an abuse of public authority for personal gains. Now, this definition is valid in societies where there is a sharp distinction between state and society, and not where the boundaries are blurred because of clientelism, caste systems, and etc., etc. So that's another question which I don't have any ready answer to this, but corruption will have to be redefined. I mean, such definitions which are on which basis, corruption has been defined, laws and reforms have been, so-called reforms have been articulated, to me are not valid. They're not context specific. And how we can come up with new definitions is a research agenda, I think, for future. But I think it is important that the state starts delivering it. The state's presence is back, which to me is absent. And absence of state here doesn't mean absence of state institution. Absence of state here means where state institutions do not follow the rule of business and, are structured in such a manner. For example, institutions like irrigation, police in Pakistan. Police stations, for example, have not been given so far any budget for running even their official day-to-day office work. Even stationery, they're not given. Only salaries are given to them. So I have, and I've written detailed ethnographies for my next book on this, for example, police corruption and other institutions, how they mobilize local resources for the official work, through mobilizing resources from local sources like landowners and other, even criminal mafia. So when such a state of affairs, when state is structured in such a manner, and all the resources are going to military and some other ministries, instead of these law enforcing agencies, then there's no motive. For example, if police stations are not adequately resourced and they have to mobilize local resources through corrupt transactions for the official work, there's no moral justification that they won't mobilize resources for personal gains as well. This is what I'm referring to blurring of boundaries between state and society. So this has to be restructured, and this will take a lot of time. It's I think we shouldn't foresee anything in the near future.
Right. And Mr. Kunda, would you like to?
Yeah, I have more of a journalistic perspective. I mean, Nadeem and Arjuna are more academics. I think we have entered in Nepal a post-ideological era where the political party that has won this supermajority doesn't really have an ideology, because the election essentially wiped out the Marxists, the Maoists, the monarchists, and even the former social democrats. So the only ideology they could be seen to have is an ideology for transparency and governance, which is like motherhood and apple pie. Who could be against it? But how are they going to do it when the structure itself is rotten from inside and hollowed out is the main question, and that's their biggest challenge. And they'll really need in the first, because the electorate that voted for them is completely impatient for change. They want to see results right away, overnight, right? And this impatience is going to drive them to perhaps do performative, showcase changes, maybe be, very selective about charging people with corruption. So this will be, in the first few months of this government, we'll probably see these showcase things happening. The danger is that because there is so much hope placed on this one party as almost a savior that is going to take us into a bright new dawn, is that if it doesn't deliver, then we are in a lot of trouble, because we are going to be entering uncharted territory. If even this fails, what next? Because a lot of people who voted for the RSP in the March 5 elections, even from the mainstream parties, even from the legacy parties, those supporters of legacy parties voted for these guys, saying, look, we've seen them for the last 35 years, they've failed miserably. Let's give these young chaps a chance. And if they don't perform in the next 5 years, we'll go back to our old parties. So we are in this sort of almost a Gramscian kind of interregnum, where the old is, kind of not yet dead, and the new has just been born. And we really don't know where we're going to be going. But then I think because it's a corruption platform on which this party won, they'll be really tempted to do some showcase cases.
Right. I mean, it is quite interesting when we look at the countries that had protests in the recent past. We even see different timelines. So with Sri Lanka, it took a few months. With Bangladesh, it was maybe 30, 40 days. I mean, Nepal, it was quite fast. And then the urgency with which you are speaking as well, in the sense that the impatience, I wonder if it reflects the increasingly shorter timelines with which these protests resulted in regime changes. And as much as we speak of the similarities among these countries and the protests that took place within them, I think a lot of differences also exist, including in terms of how polarized the situations are. In Bangladesh's case, I think we see the level of polarization to be extremely high, where one party is excluded from the electoral equation. And in Sri Lanka too, I think the level of political polarization is quite alarmingly high. In Nepal, I'm assuming it's a similar context.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I'm taking on board both the other speakers' comments on the importance of historicizing what anti-corruption means in post-colonial societies such as ourselves, whether this idea of surgically removing corruption would be the answer to would lead to this ideal democracy that has been sold to us. So that's a really interesting, nuanced take on it. We'll go to some of the questions in the chat box. There are 4 of them. I see Dr. Nadeem has answered one of them. So I'll go to the question by Anand Kumar, which asks, in Nepal's Gen Z-led protest movement, what specific institutional mechanisms, such as formal youth representation in party structures or statutory citizen oversight boards, can convert this episodic street mobilization into sustained policy influence without it being co-opted by traditional political elites? So, Mr. Kunda, could you take that question?
Yeah, because there are some of these young protesters who actually won the election. So they're in parliament now. And I think they will be quite tempted to use the commission on the anti-corruption commission, which was formed about 25, 30 years ago, and which was completely co-opted by the parties to go after their political rivals in the past. So it was very selective prosecution of so-called corruption. I think if they use those mechanisms, it will not be very useful because of what has happened in the past. The big fish got away, the small fish were caught, and I think what maybe needs to be done is for the legislature to be much more proactive with younger people in the committees who can then pursue some real cases and then go after the real crowd, because we all know who the crooks are. The media has been exposing them for the past 5 years and 10 years. And so I think the role of civil society and media becomes really important here, especially with the supermajority, because there will be no other check and balance in Nepal otherwise. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I don't know if that answered the question.
Yes, I think it does. And I think Professor Arjun also mentioned this, the shift from passive to active citizens participating, that this was really quite, I think, a notable shift in Sri Lanka's case, if at all. And so civil society acting as a check on parliamentary politics or formal power structures. I think in Sri Lanka's case, it's probably a similar situation. Maybe the next question is for Professor Arjuna, which is by Dr. Tilak Abesinghe. It says there's a gap between actual levels of corruption and the level that people believe, so perceptions. And this is an effect of social media. As a result, even the non-corrupt get harassed and prosecuted, and how to address this problem.
Professor Abhishek, that's an extremely important question. My take is a little different. I actually think that social media is manipulated. So this level of corruption and the people's belief in it, that's also manipulated. I don't want to, you know, talk about things that are too controversial, but there are groups that actually their entire task is to be able to create a kind of atmosphere and so on that targets certain kinds of corruption, certain kinds of people, and whitewashes others. Yes, so the problem is there. It's not. That's why I keep saying these are not natural, spontaneous kinds of things. Not the Aragale, not any of these. Are all carefully manipulated, and they're designed and implemented by almost full-time professionals. But anyway, to leave that aside, yes, there is a key issue about the perception of corruption, and those who are in positions of not even high power, sort of relative kind of authority, are extremely scared and vulnerable about being accused of being corrupt. That's what I was trying to point to when I said that there are people who are unable to take decisions, officers who are unable to take decisions, universities that can't proceed the way they're used to, all kinds of things, because of this perception and prosecution in the sort of court of public opinion that they are corrupt. Now, the one way to deal with this, I think, is we need to have a clear and credible framework where this needs to be done. I think that's really lacking. Even Seobock has charges, counter charges, accusations, counter accusations. They're being selective. We don't have, for example, the one promise that was made, and that the IMF in 6 pages actually recommended the creation of a public prosecutor's office. We are allowing the Attorney General's department staff members to write a protest saying they don't want to be they don't want bifurcation, and we're accepting that. So we need, actually, it's through the legal process operating that we can separate the fluff from whatever it is, and the threats from the in fact, this is something I learned. A threat is greater than its execution. So the threat of corruption on an honest individual is debilitating. They can't do anything because they're terrified. They don't exist. But the only way to do that is actually implement this stuff. We are very low on the implementation. That's one. The second is, if we try to address this systemic thing, what I call quiet corruption, if we can, it used to be called deep corruption, but after Trump, you can't use this deep word anywhere without it being completely maligned. But see, if we have to try to understand, we don't have, for example, a conflict of interest discourse, much less laws on it. Now, that's fundamental. We need to be able to understand. Now, if we can do things like that, a conflict of interest thing is something I'm very clear. If that is there in place and implemented, that will address a lot of these issues, because many of the professionals who are, caught as in you are being corrupted, so on, if they say, look, I don't have any conflict of interest, these are the issues, whereas those who have conflict of interest needs to declare it, and if they don't declare it, they need to be called on it. So those protocols are not there. We don't have any system. We just have this accusatory thing. You're corrupt, so and so is corrupt, you stole this, you did something else, we prosecute you, we keep that going on for years and years. That terrifies people. So we don't have a system in place. We don't have a discourse. I really think if there's one thing that we need, it's this conflict of interest argument. For example, if the former president appoints his schoolmates to positions of power, now that's wrong. If another president appoints his batchmates in the university to positions of power, that is equally wrong. But one is seen as okay and the other is seen as corrupt. So we need these systems in place. Imagine a country that does not have a discourse on conflict of interest.
Yes, thank you. There is a question that is open to all the speakers by Sandeep Bharadwaj, which is that what factors determine whether an anti-corruption movement would give rise to an entirely new political force, or would it get captured by the opposition? And second, are parties that come to power as anti-corruption crusaders themselves more vulnerable to corruption charges when they are in power? Would anyone, all 3 speakers are welcome to give their comments on this.
The real danger is that absolute power will corrupt absolutely, especially when they have such a big majority here. So we really have to be vigilant. But hopefully the electorate will keep a vigilant watch on this party and how it performs. And if it doesn't, we may not even, it may not even last 5 years. We'll have another early election. And also because it came to power through fire and arson and this deaths on the streets, it could lead other parties to feel like that's the only way to overthrow someone who is corrupt and replace it with another unsavory government. So there's a real danger of reversal and democratic backsliding. We were backsliding anyway, but I think this process could, become even more pronounced in future if there is a lack of performance and transparency and accountability.
Right. To any of the other speakers?
Yeah, I think one of the sad things that we have to confront is lack of corruption is often lack of opportunity, nothing else. So what you get is new, as Che Guevara said, we chase out corrupt leaders only to find new leaders become corrupt. That's another way of saying what Kunda said. But I think the point is the systems need to be in place. We are seeing in Sri Lanka this written in spades. We're seeing people who did not have the opportunity to be corrupt are now showing tendencies of corruption. And I think the best example to tell you is because this is it's an ideological issue. I remember you talked about it. We didn't discuss ideology enough. The former president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, was asked by, I think, Al Jazeera or something, how he had 300 and odd members of his family in positions of power. And his response, I think, is fantastic. He said, if you can't help your family, what's the point of being president? I think so. We still have a bit of that mindset. That's what we need. So it needs to be part of it's. I mean, I think this Professor Malik also said that it has to be part of a bigger education process. We educate our children. It has to be part of the curriculum. We have to bring all of that stuff. There are no quick fixes, but temporarily, I think we need to be able to make sure the whatever government must begin by prosecuting members of its own party for acts of corruption before they look at other people. If you do that, then you're establishing bona fides and you're showing that it's not a weapon. Now it is a weapon. When it's a weapon, the weapon is used. The people know indiscriminately against honest politicians. There's no such thing. I mean, against honest bureaucrats and various other people. So that's the problem, that we need to be able to make sure that this is something that's a principle, not a weapon. We need to be able to have education about it, and we need to be able to be very clear that ideological factors don't get into this.
I'd like to ask the final question because we're in the final minutes of this session. Again, open to all the speakers. It asks, situating anti-corruption within the realm of politics is important, as all speakers did, thereby negating the attempts to frame anti-corruption as technocratic and apolitical. What moral, political imaginaries and systemic alternatives do such larger-than-life anti-corruption narratives sideline? So it's asking about alternative moral political imaginaries. I think it's an important question because the role of morality in politics, I think, is ever more important in the current context. How would the speakers like to respond?
I think I did post the answer, but I can sort of address this.
Yes.
Framing anti-corruption as politics is sidelines, alternative moral political imaginary is centered on redistribution, for example, social justice and structural reform. So it privileges punitive individualized blame over systemic change, obscuring class relations, patronage networks, and institutional redesign. So consequently, transformative agenda, democratization, welfare expansion, and accountability through collective governance are marginalized, by spectacle-driven, leader-centric narratives. This is what I think is this situation is.
Right. Would the other speakers like to give any closing remarks on this?
Yeah, I'm a little troubled by this because I firmly think that the anti-corruption thing needs to be ethical, but not technocratic. I think the moment it becomes technocratic,
Yes.
we are identifying that there is a level playing field. I think that a police officer who takes 50 rupees somewhere and somebody who takes 20 million, that's not the same. We need to have a level playing field for that. So I would like to say that there is an ethico-political kind of dimension. I don't think anti-corruption is a neutral thing at all, as I said, because it depends on where you are, what you do, and what your status is, and do you have a handicapped child that you have to look after, all that kind of stuff. But so what I'm saying is, we need to have an but for that we need a public discourse. I would say the beginning is there needs to be a public discourse and a safe space, an enabling environment. Sorry for the cliches, but an enabling environment where these things can be discussed, and we need to be to understand. And ground rules need to be set up, and the ground rules need to have public participation. They can't be rules that are set up by different governments for their own interests, which is what happens now.
Mr. Kunda?
Well, I think using morality or belief in sin or religious institutions to control corruption would not really work, because we've seen some of the most fundamentalist countries are the most corrupt. But I think what we have to tackle is that corruption is seen as a given. It's accepted. It's almost like it's the only way to get things done. It lubricates the whole government mechanism, and therefore it is acceptable. Otherwise, if there was no corruption, we would not get anything done. So that kind of fatalism is what we have to battle at the societal level. And I think, and leave the sort of more ideological discourse for later. And here, I think the main failure has been that although the media has been investigated and exposing corruption at the highest levels of government, not much has been done. There's been no follow-up. So the media cannot take you to the courts or cannot do the policing. We can just expose it. And that's where the failure has been. And I think we have to somehow tackle the fatalism in society. The fact that, well, we'll be reincarnated, so maybe the next life will be better. Sorry.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone.
I'll
Yes.
follow just very brief comment. I agree with Arjun, that corruption cannot be overcome through technocratic means or good policies, this and that. It is only possible to, reform in the power structures, which I think will take a lot of time. It's not easy.
Well, thank you to all the speakers. I think that was a very rich discussion and covered a lot of themes regarding corruption, anti-corruption, and the politics of structural change in South Asia. We will be having our next session in half an hour at 11 o'clock in the morning in Singapore time, which will be looking at issues of social media and the digital age and protests during that time. So thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.